Old Grognard says, let's learn how scales work in D6 Star Wars 2nd Edition, revised and expanded. Here's the basic idea behind what scales are and how they work. Small things have an easier time hitting large things when they attack them. The flip side is that the large thing has an easier time resisting the damage the small thing does. We see an example of this in The Empire Strikes Back when snow speeders are put up against Imperial walkers. The speeders don't have much trouble hitting the walkers, but the walkers just shrug off any damage the rebels were hoping to inflict. When a large thing attacks a small thing, the situation is reversed. The small thing has an easier time evading the large thing. On the other hand, if the larger thing does hit, it has an easier time inflicting damage. We see an example of this in Episode 4 when the rebels attack the Death Star with starfighters, and we get this line here. Now that we have a basic idea of the intent behind scales and what they do, let's look at the actual game mechanics behind how they work. For this, we need to go to page 95 in the R&E book. This is what it tells us in the text block titled Scale. You may notice that a landspeeder may have a body strength of 2D, while a character can have a strength of 4D. Does that mean that the character is tougher than the landspeeder? No. The game uses scales to show the differences between different sizes and types of objects. You add or subtract dice to attack rolls, dodge rolls, and damage rolls to show these differences. The scales from lowest to highest are Character, Speeder, Walker, Starfighter, Capital, and Death Star. The scale modifiers reflect the differences between small, fragile targets, like characters, and large, tough targets, like Star Destroyers. This is what the scale chart in the book looks like. What the thing at the bottom means is that if you have two things of different scales interacting, you subtract the smaller from the larger to get what they call the adjusted modifier. So in the case of snow speeders versus walkers, your adjusted scale modifier would be 2D. In the case of Death Star turrets, which are capital scale, versus starfighters, the adjusted modifier would be 6D. A question you might have at this point is, how do I know what scale something is? This is a good question because the first part of resolving interactions between things that are different scales is to figure out what scale those things are. Most characters, droids, and creatures are character scale. If they aren't, their scale will be listed in their description. Vehicles have their stats listed in a standard format. For example, this is the speeder Raisin and Adult Black Dragon's characters had in the last episode. If you look at the stats, you can see that it's speeder scale right here. If a vehicle has weapons built in, they'll be the same scale as the vehicle unless the weapon's description says otherwise. You mostly see this on capital ships that have starfighter scale weapons for defending against fighters. Here's an example, and you can see here that the weapon's scale is listed to show that it's a different scale than the ship. So now that we know how to figure out what scale things are, and we know how to figure the scale modifier, how do we use this to resolve attacks and damage between vehicles, characters, droids, etc.? If two things are the same scale, you just use the stats they have normally without any scale modifiers. If a smaller scale is attacking a larger scale, the smaller scale adds the adjusted scale modifier to their attack rolls. So, using the example of the snow speeders from earlier, if the pilots fire at the Imperial walkers, they would get to add the scale modifier of 2D to their attack rolls, increasing their chances of scoring a hit. If they did hit, when the walkers roll to resist damage, they would add the scale modifier, which again is 2D, to the vehicle's body strength roll when resisting damage. When a larger scale attacks a smaller scale target, the smaller target gets to add the scale modifier to their dodge roll to evade incoming attacks. So using the Death Star attack from earlier, the starfighters would add 6D to their piloting rolls to evade the turrets if they chose to dodge. If one of the turrets did manage to hit one of the starfighters, they would add the 6D to their damage roll, which would almost guarantee that they one-shot the fighter. Now it's time to talk about house rules, or in this case, a house rule, since we only have one. How this house rule works is that when we have a larger scaled weapon used to attack a smaller scale target, if the smaller scale target dodges, they roll their dodge normally, and we instead subtract the scale modifier from the attack roll. The reasoning behind this is that if you add the bonus to the dodge roll and there are two different scales of attackers involved, you have to keep track of a different dodge total for each scale. If you instead modify the attack roll, you can use one dodge total for all attacks regardless of scale. Let's use the example of the snow speeders versus walkers from earlier. However, let's have the Imperial infantry join in trying to shoot down the snow speeders and have the speeder pilots decide to dodge. Rules as written, we would add the scale modifier to the dodge versus the walkers, but not versus the infantry. Because of this, we would have to keep track of two different dodge totals for each speeder, one for character scale attacks and one for the walkers. Using the house rule, all of the modifiers would be done on the attack rolls, so in this case the infantry would get plus 2D to hit because they're character scale attacking a speeder scale target, and the walkers would get minus 2D to hit because they're walker scale attacking a speeder scale target. And this would allow us to only roll and keep track of one dodge for each vehicle. This may or may not be easier for you. It's worked well for me, so I thought I would share. Now that we've covered scales and a house rule regarding them, here are some relevant page numbers if you want to look this stuff up for yourself. And I put the links to some related videos over here on the right. Thanks for watching. Unmotivated Skeleton and I would like to wish you a wonderful rest of your day.